Welcome to another edition of Down the Road. We're going to get a chance today to visit with somebody that was near and dear to me. My good friend David Crothers passed away, head of North Dakota Broadband for years, back when it was the North Dakota Rural Telephone Cooperatives Association. But he is the strongest leader when it came to connecting rural North Dakota with the world and making sure we didn't get left behind when it came to fiber and it came to broadband. We're going to visit about that today. We'll get a chance to remember the great leader that he was. Also, I'm sick of it too. Northwest North Dakota, over 800 poles on the ground, people out of power, and they're going to be out of power for quite some time. This weather has just been atrocious this spring. We'll visit with Greg Gust about that. Greg is with the National Weather Service, and we'll get his take on when and if this is ever going to change, when this weather pattern might finally break. You've seen him on with us before. Dr. Thomas Ambrosio is one of the favorite professors. He isn't going to like that I said that. At North Dakota State University, one of those classes that people want to get in because it's conversational. It's the type of class where you could go in and just throw some ideas at and maybe get called out on those, but at least it's a place where you go learn. He's a professor of political science at North Dakota State University. Dr. Ambrosio, good to have you coming down the road with us.
Glad to be here once again.
Okay, I'm going to make you do this right away.
Sounds good.
Grade the war in terms of Ukraine and in terms of Russia.
Right. So Ukraine, I would give an A to. They have done far better than expectations. They have reinforced their national identity, and they have, of course, saved their independence and their sovereignty, at least in some form. For Russia, I would not give it an F. I wouldn't even give it a D. D. I mean, it would be probably maybe a D plus, C minus. If I was grading on a curve, probably a C minus, because I think what's going to happen is they're going to get a huge chunk of Ukraine when all is said and done. Not that they're going to be formally given it. It won't be legal, but they will have it when all is said and done, which is going to be that south and eastern part of Ukraine.
Is that a part that there was a lot of talk about that wanting to go to Russia, that their roots were with Russia? Is that the area we're talking about? And if so, are the citizens of that area going to feel as though, hey, this was okay with us?
Not as much as people thought initially. I think there is a lot more resistance, even amongst those who are native Russian speakers. So the language situation is very complicated there. I think that the way Russia has treated civilians, what Russia has done in its war, has turned a lot of even those who might be somewhat pro-Russian against Russia. So it is going to be an occupation of these areas for a good part of the areas in the very far east. That will be something that they want to be part of Russia. Maybe some parts of the south, but it's going to be difficult for Russia to even control it. But I think at the end they will get that part of Ukraine, again, not legally, but it will be something that they essentially control.
Is that going to be deemed a victory for anyone who invades a country, gets their butt handed to them militarily in certain areas, and yet still leaves with geography?
I would see it as a victory for Russia. And also they can sell it to their people that way. Essentially, they were able to say that they defended Russian speakers in the East against what the Russians claim is genocide, which is not the case, genocide against them. They can also claim additional territories and a land bridge between Crimea and Russia itself in this area that goes all the way back to Catherine the Great, called Novorossiya, New Russia. They won't get all of it, but it's not a complete failure, but we tend to think of war in terms of winners and losers, but reality is wars tend to be much more in the shades of gray.
So we talked about it in relation to the people. What about the geography? What do they gain? Are we talking about farmland? Are we talking about access to the Black Sea? Are we talking about the riches that can go with a certain area? I mean, what does Russia gain? A leader like Vladimir Putin that, quite frankly, doesn't care about human life.
Right. The economic gains are I mean, this is an area that's going to be devastated by war. I mean, Mariupol, which is the largest city on that part of the Azov Sea, is completely destroyed. I mean, economically, they're not going to get much. There's some farmland. You have potentially natural gas deposits. But it's really symbolic. I think that's more important here. We tend to think a lot of times in terms of cost-benefit analysis, in terms of money, but this is a war over symbolism. This is a war over identity. This is a war over national sense of culture. And that's actually, I think, more important for Russia. And that will be enough. If I'm Vladimir Putin, I can sell that to my population if I control the media, if I control access to outside information, and I control the opposition. So who's going to say otherwise?
So you only gave, Dr. Ambrosio, you only gave Russia on a curve a C minus. Militarily is what I'm guessing you were working from. Why so bad? I mean, you've got Russia, which was one of the biggest world powers in many people's minds, a nuclear country, a country that for years was the country to be feared in terms of communism, in terms of that check and balance in that Cold War. And yet here they sit taking on Ukraine.
Right.
And I'm sorry, but nobody going into this war thought that the Ukrainian military was going to be something that was this tough against that great big war machine. I mean, how did this either surprise anyone? And if it didn't surprise you, how the heck did we miss it?
I think actually it surprised me and it surprised a lot of people. The Russians did not fight the way they were supposed to. They tried a lightning strike to capture Ukraine by sending all these troops without adequate support into or towards Kyiv and other cities, and that didn't work. Now, I would give them an A had they not tried all that and had to withdraw from territories, had they just focused on this area that they'll likely keep. They would have gotten, actually, it would have been a good potential grade, but they tried something and either they did not plan for the resistance, that's pretty clear, didn't fight the way they were supposed to. They may not be able to fight the way they were supposed to in terms of combined arms, adequately using artillery, air support, ground troops, anti-air, all that together, which is what a modern army does. They did not do that. Now, is it that they're so corrupt that they can't do that anymore in terms of military spending? Did they just simply underestimate their opponents? We don't really know, but clearly that part was a complete failure.
So, okay, we talk about equipment, I look at the news reports as much as anyone. You're talking about tires that are 40 years old. You're talking about tanks that have been taken over by the Ukrainian army. You're talking about soldiers didn't know where they were going to go. All of that aside, in terms of Russia and its military and how it wasn't ready, what about the Ukrainian army? How fierce they've been, and equipment. I realize a lot of that equipment is coming from NATO countries, ourselves included, but when this first happened, it wasn't like there was as big of a buildup as what we're seeing now. And so to know that the Ukrainian army was this ready, that they were ready to defend themselves to this level, I mean, did that surprise you at all?
It actually, it did in terms of success, but not in terms of their willingness to defend their homeland. I mean, it's their home. We also are learning more about kind of what happened militarily. Tanks maybe there's a big debate going on right now within military circles whether or not tanks are even relevant anymore, given the use of drones, given the Javelin missiles that they had already been, the Ukrainians already been provided with, which easily take out tanks. But also the Ukrainians were able to tactically do certain things to force Russians into very narrow lines of advance in which they could be easily ambushed. And the Russians were able to make a significant advance, but then they outstripped their supply lines. And they did not adequately support those troops. So it was both fortunate for the Ukrainians that the Russians did this so badly, but also they're fighting for their homes. And their sense of nationalism was probably stronger than anyone outside of Ukraine or most observers outside Ukraine estimated.
So you talk about media coverage, and we've done a lot of that here on Down the Road, but we've had individuals that are from and lived in Kyiv, and we've brought individuals that have a financial interest there. But, over the last couple of weeks, you've had the Prime Minister of England, you've had just this last weekend, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State in the United States of America all be to Kyiv.
Right.
And so are we at times, because we see the devastation where the war is being fought, are we a little blind to the fact that this country is where it is, to where these type of leaders can still come and meet Zelensky?
Well, especially the fact that the Russians have withdrawn from that entire area around Kyiv. Part of, I think, the Ukrainians' willingness to fight was based upon the fact they had the world around them, or the world backing them, which means that they know it's not hopeless. And that in of itself is a significant military advantage. So the fact that we went there is interesting, but it's also pretty clear now, and actually the Secretary of Defense stated it, which I was surprised. He actually stated that we want to see Russia weakened through this. Mm-hmm. And we are now, we have been, but now it's the mask has slipped completely. We are in a full-blown proxy war against Russia. The Ukrainians are going to be part of a larger strategy against Russia. And while we support the Ukrainians, we support democracy, we support freedom, we support victims of aggression, there's also a little bit of instrumental. They're being used instrumentally by us a bit.
A little bit.
And there is an entire kind of faction within the administration in terms of foreign policy thinking who see this Ukraine war as something we can take advantage of, just as we did in Afghanistan. Yeah. And just as the Russians did in Vietnam and in Korea.
Before the break, you talked about how, to some degree, what's happening here for the U.S., where Blinken said, look, we want to weaken Russia, which I was surprised, too, that he went that far and said that. I just thought it was an air of honesty. I loved it. Yeah. But I was surprised he said it. And then you mentioned before the break about how if that benefits us, this could be somewhat of a proxy war where others are doing the work for us. And I want to give you a chance to expound on that. Right.
Where we can't fight Russia directly. Obviously, they have nuclear weapons, but we want to see Russia weakened. We want to see, in our wildest dreams, we want to see the overthrow of Vladimir Putin, and we want to see a democratically elected government installed, which is not going to happen probably for the foreseeable future. Even if Putin goes, it'll be someone who's Putin maybe light at best. But
there's no Boris Yeltsin coming.
There's no Boris Yeltsin, and there's no idea like any kind of democratic leader rising up because the state is probably too strong. Then again, revolutions happen.
In that country in particular.
In that country, we've seen a bunch of those. So it's possible, but at least from our perspective, we see ourselves locked into this great power conflict with Russia and China. We've made that clear since 2016 or so, 2016, 2017. And that is kind of driving our foreign policy now. We've kind of moved away from terrorism onto this great power conflict, which means that this is a horrible situation for the Ukrainians, but potentially a good opportunity for the United States because Russia and China are aligned, and this is a way to weaken China's junior partner and to weaken Russia. And in the grand scheme of kind of international politics, it's something that you do. We like to think that maybe those really cynical great power politics are something that we've moved on from, but it's still there.
So you say China's junior partner. Is that what's keeping NATO from boots on the ground? Is that what's keeping NATO from saying, you know what we're seeing is atrocities, we're seeing mass graves. Some have used the word genocide. I know that's not a word that you want to use or that you will not push back on in your classroom. That being said, there's enough there for the world to say, we're getting in. We're going to do something about this. We're going to use the power and the might of NATO other than shipping goods, shipping arms, those type of things. So is it China that is causing us to say, no, we get in it. It's a war we didn't want to get in.
No, it's not China. It's actually Russia by itself.
Okay.
I don't think there's enough support within NATO members to put boots on the ground, even if we took the nuclear weapons off the table. But no one wants to get involved in a war with Russia, a conventional war with Russia. So that in of itself, China, that is really not relevant for that part. We can do this kind of on the cheap. And we can weaken Russia, and Russia has weakened itself by invading Ukraine, and it's going to go further down. One of my concerns is that if we see this as too much as an opportunity, even if the Ukrainians are willing to get some kind of a peace deal or work towards some kind of peace deal with Russia, that we won't support it. And we will make it so that President Zelensky and the people around him will be less likely to support a peace. And this war will simply grind on.
So you think President Zelensky doesn't sign off on any peace deal unless NATO tells him to?
I'm not sure it's going to be that direct, but it'll.
Well, let's say behind the scenes.
It'll be either behind the scenes, or we'll say, "Hey, you can still win. We'll give you more weapons. You can still win," and rather than saying, "Okay, yes, we've won a lot, and we kept our independence, we kept our sovereignty, but the future is dark if we get into this grinding, continuous war in the Donbass region in the east that we probably cannot win. We can't push Russia out of Ukraine. I mean, or the Ukrainians can't do it. Russia, unless there's some kind of revolution in Russia, Vladimir Putin, as well as the Russian government, has made it clear this is an existential issue for them. This is one that they consider of supreme importance. They're not going to be willing to be pushed out or to simply give up. And a ceasefire may be the best outcome for everyone. It's not just, it's not right, but it's very likely that this will be the only way to stop more deaths.
My dad never built a bunker in my backyard. You know, when all this threat of nuclear war, and you know the era because you're a student of it. But I never woke up in the morning fearing Russia as a nuclear threat. And maybe that's because of being naive, thinking that the U.S. had the type of technology that could shoot it down, that wouldn't let it ever get to that point. And yet in this war, it appears that nuclear weaponry constantly being threatened has affected policy. And I'm curious what you think about that.
I think it always has. I think when kind of we were growing up, there was much more of a sense of, well, kind of fatalism. It's going to happen no matter, if it happens, it happens. Nothing we can do about it. But Russia has made it so clear what its position is. And you have to give it to the United States and in NATO to at least respect those red lines. Of course, we've drawn our own red lines, which are the NATO members. But of course, you have this blank spot.
Chemical warfare, for example.
Right. We have this blank spot, which is Ukraine, and Russia would have to do so much more in terms of atrocities for me to even think about NATO actually getting involved.
Okay.
It's not part of what we're willing to do. Now, if it was Baltics, maybe.
I want to tell you my theory. That you can look at me like, don't write that in the form of a paper in my classroom. But I said at the very beginning of this war, prior to him going into war, when the Biden administration nailed it and said they're going in, they're going to invade Ukraine, I said he looked puffy. That he looked, I've been around athletics all my life. I know what somebody juiced up on steroids looks like. He just looked puffy. And then, and I said, something's wrong. He's not feeling well. I don't know that it's on the mental side, even though I think he's a mass killer. And so there is something wrong mentally there. But then just recently, I see him, Tom, and he's hanging onto a table for 20 minutes. Nobody does that. Nobody goes into a meeting and, we may go like this, but we're not going to sit there like this. And I watched his gait when he walked, and I watched his left arm when he walked. There's something physically wrong with this man.
There could be. There very well could be.
Which would lead to him saying, what the heck? If I'm ever going to do this, now's the time to do it.
And also, That's possible, and if it is the case, that may explain why he was willing to gamble at this point, why he was willing to to roll the dice. The idea of cementing one's legacy, especially in Russia, as the man who reunited the Russians, and for them it means Russia, the Belarusians, basically white Russians, as well as the little Russians, as they call the Ukrainians, to reunite the Eastern Slavs. Something that has been on the agenda for Russia ever since Russia was created. And to keep that could be a powerful motive. I don't necessarily like to, kind of put the world leaders on a couch, because I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. But if that were the case, then that would actually explain a lot, potentially, at least in terms of timing and his willingness to gamble.